Hi, my name is James, and today I'll be covering Chapter 3 of How Economics um, Explains the World by Andrew Lay. So, um, there's something to consider with economics, and a big problem is distance, right? So Andrew Lay writes about how there's historical context of maritime exploration. And one of the core economic arguments he uses is the concern for reduction of transaction costs and the integration of global markets. So prior to the 15th century, the global economy was um, somewhat defined by the tyranny of distance, right? It was a primary constraint on having economic growth, but at the cost of transporting goods. So the trade between major centers of production, for example, in Asia, and the consumption of it in Europe was restricted to primarily what's known as the Silk Road. Um, for example, the English would export goods like tea. That was a major exporter. They loved tea, and they could only transport it through the Silk Road. Um, so that was prior to the 15th century, right? But economically, while this road was good for diversifying goods and services and items for nations, expanding far back as the Roman Empire, it was inefficient due to the phenomenon known as double marginalization. So, basically, a commodity such as, like, let's say, nutmeg or cloves, which originated um, in Asia was kind of hard to pass through a complex chain of intermediaries, right? Malay traders, Indian merchants. Then the Indian merchants had to go to Arab caravans, and then they had to go to Venetian sailors, and then they had this whole amount of transportation through a supply chain. This caused a lot of economic friction because maybe the item would get spoiled, or maybe there would be loss of transportation, loss of goods, something could happen in transit. It was very much not as efficient as they wanted to. So other problems that would happen would be rent seeking, which is what local rulers would do on the route. You know, they would extract tariffs, right? I know we're all pretty familiar with tariffs. That's the uh that was basically the idea of protection payment, right? It didn't add any value to the good. It just made it so that the good was harder to obtain from a currency standpoint. They had what's called compounding markups, which is each intermediary would be price the goods. They would price the goods above marginal cost to capture a profit. This created a compounding amount of price wedge, where Andrew Lay would note that the price of paper in European markets was often 50 times higher than the price paid to the primary producer in India. Um, so this price differential, it pretty much served as a powerful price signal, right? It's an indicated massive arbitrage opportunity. So any agent capable of bypassing this intermediary chain had an economic advantage, and that's why in this chapter he calls it the economic objective of being the age of sail. So it was about optimizing the supply chain. So here I have a graph of this is more modern. It applies more to our modern way of life, but let's say you might have technology in Asia. that gets manufactured. It has to go through the factory. Then, as the cost in or the price increases, maybe it goes to the exporter, maybe it goes to the wholesaler, then the importer, distributor, retailer, and then all the way until the cost just shoots up when it finally hits its destination, which is Europe. Um, so if so basically each step on this graph is a middleman. Yeah, it's sort of a vertical wage gap, for vertical price gap for transaction cost. Um, so something I also found very fascinating in the chapter is that um, the solution they proposed for the tyranny of distance appeared to be in the form of a positive supply shock, which was in the transportation technology, right? So this shock basically comprised of three separate and specific capital improvements, right? One was the Caravel hull, one was the Latine sail, and the other one was the Sea Astrolabe, right? So the Latine sail was a triangular ship, or triangular sail that was adopted from Arab traders, right? It allowed European vessels to tack against the wind, right? This fundamentally altered the cost structure of how shipping was done because it reduced the variable cost of the voyage itself. You know, captains no seafarers and captains, they no longer had to be at the mercy of the wind, right? They were they were more so uh they were more so now able to utilize the rate of um the weight of the ship, against the seasonal winds, which was huge in the industry. So, simultaneously, at the same time, you had the Sea of Astrolabe, right? It allowed for the calculation of latitude, which enabled blue water sailing. This reduced the amount of shipwrecks that would occur along the coastlines, and you could actually plot out direct routing, right? Um, but the most significant impact um, Lay points out was the achievement of uh, the economies of scale, right? It was the overland trade, which was subject to a strict volume constraint. So the camel caravans were limited to roughly maybe 400 pounds per animal. Um, so maybe in the 16th century, the carrack could transport thousands of tons, and this drastically produced a reduction of the average of total cost per unit of cargo. So it allowed for more profitable seafaring trade, not just high value luxury items like gold or maybe bulk commodities like spices. Uh, the shift pretty much marked the beginning of a price convergence, right? And they call it the law of one price across global markets. Pretty much uh, standardized prices to be more of maybe closer to that of the local distributors. Um, so here I have a graph to show you standard supply and demand. The demand curve is inelastic, and the supply curve shifts significantly to the right. Um, we label this shift as technological innovation, right? Um, so before we can analyze the corporate structures of the North, we also have to acknowledge the financial infrastructures that made large-scale trade possible. So this didn't originate in the Atlantic. It actually originated in Italy. And Andrew Lay covers it when he mentions the Medici family. So Lay ends up identifying the Medici Bank, which was founded in 1397. This was a critical economic institution. They had numerous contributions, their primary being the popularization of the double entry bookkeeping. Um, this idea was absolutely revolutionary. It reduced information asymmetry. So by clearing uh, the recording of debts and credit, uh, merchants could accurately track the complex long distance accounts for the first time. So this allowed for transparency, which also allowed the banking to scale beyond just a single city state. It massive expansion of the banks. Um, Medici illustrated the economics of patronage as well, which was um, which was not just a thing for bankers. It was also one of the most successful ideas of the time, and he was considered one of the most successful philanthropists in history. He basically funded the Italian Renaissance with the amount of capital he was able to gain. So, in economic terms, this means that they were able to convert financial capital into social capital and public goods. Lay would end up noting that they didn't really govern through military conquest, which was sort of a new idea. They governed through economic influence, and this is what's known as a precursor to soft power that we observe in our modern global trade. It was pretty much revolutionary at its time. Um, so something to mention also is that when technological change happens, it's very necessary for growth. Um, but insufficient without parallel institutional change. So you need both to happen. You need parallel institutional change to happen for technological change as well. So ocean voyages were high risk or high variance ventures. The probability of total loss due to storm, maybe they would have pirates raiding their ships or like scurvy or diseases on the ship was often viewed significant that would hurt the voyage. Um, so to mitigate this, the Dutch economy had this idea where they would innovate the joint stock company. So this innovation would lead to the creation of the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, which was founded in 1602. Basically, this institution solved the liquidity constraints through risk pooling. Basically, in a traditional partnership, an investor would bear the full liability. They call it bore of a specific voyage. So the joint stock company allowed investors to purchase fractional ownership in a fleet, and then this would end up being distributed uh, if the risk of any single ship sinking across thousands of shareholders, which would end up stabilizing returns and encourage massive capital accumulation. Um, so this is a chart of maybe something that would look like a visual chart of something that would look like the Dust East India Company with shareholder equity. They called it institutional risk pooling. And you would have many different slices that maybe different shareholders would own. Um, it's very fascinating. It was pretty necessary to have a correct view in order to not be burdened with having massive loss. Um, One of the misconceptions in Dutch finance was also noted as tulip mania, which Andrew Lay pointed out. So this is often cited in 1637 about a crash in tulip prices as evidence of irrational market behavior. And Lay would go on to argue that the tulip market demonstrated a sophistication of Dutch financial instruments, right? Um, Essentially, these Dutch instruments, um, there were about traders being able to utilize future contracts, which was the agreement to buy or sell an asset as a at a predetermined price at a specific time in the future. So while the asset, let's say the flower, the tulip, was trivial, the financial mechanism was actually advanced for its time. It mirrored derivatives on the market using agriculture. So the VOC represented a market failure, which would lead to what's called a monopoly, right? And the company operated a government charter that banned competition. If you played the board game Monopoly, the whole goal of that is to end up, it's a board game, right? It's to end up controlling the whole entire board, which you could buy residential pieces and you just be kind of like this conglomerate, this massive mega corporation of property ownership. Uh, that's essentially what the VOC did, right? It utilized its market power to restrict supply and artificially inflate prices, and it ended up extracting consumer surplus and engaging in violent rent extraction in Indonesia. So, um, so in order to better understand this, we have to say that we analyze macroeconomics as a consequence of the era, right? Um, Maybe you could take a look at the Spanish Empire following the conquest of America, how Spain imported vast quantities of silver and gold in the 16th century, or other precious metals, which constituted the money supply. Spain experience serves kind of like an example, like a strong example of resource curse, which in modern economics they refer to it as Dutch disease, which is the sudden influx of an item, like let's say silver, caused a rapid expansion of the money supply, which ended up outpacing the growth in real output. So this ended up resulting in severe inflation. Um, Basically, as domestic prices in Spain rose, Spanish manufacturing of goods became uncompetitive in international markets. Like sh the textile and maybe shipbuilding industries in the region ended up collapsing because foreign goods were way cheaper and they just couldn't keep up. So Spain effectively ended up deindustrializing and kind of substituting a domestic production for goods funded by um, resource rents. So this reliance on extraction was kind of led to stagnation for Spain. And then we see this same pattern ending up to be repeating throughout history. A more modern example is maybe the oil-rich states in the 20th century. They're experiencing a similar aspect to this just because they have trouble keeping up with much cheaper oil in the Middle East. So, one of the most critical analysis for this chapter is the concern for long-running impacts of colonialism on global inequality. Lay would end up arguing the theory of mortality as an institutional path dependence, right? Um, so here uh, you have maybe And a good example of, sorry, you have a graph here of the inflow of precious metals, um, leading to an increased money supply, which leads to high inflation, which leads to domestic manufacturing collapses. It's sort of a way to draw, this is to show you a linear flow chart of how the inflammation mechanism happens, the resource curves. So, the economic model for European colonizers would end up being rational agents. They face different constraints based on the environment or the diseased environment. You have inclusive institutions in the region with low mortality rates, like North America, settlers anticipated a long presence, so they established institutions that protected property rights. They enforced contracts. They made sure that the government had limited power. They wanted inclusive laws because they incentivized investments by the broad population, right? You also have extractive institutions, which in regions with high mortality rates, you have like in West Africa, where you would have an abundance of malaria developing or yellow fever. Settlers didn't want to establish a permanent residence here. So they established extractive institutions, which were mainly designed solely to transfer resources and labor to uh, different continents as quickly as possible. And Lay would end up arguing that these initial institutions created path dependence for these colonies. Even after these colonies would end up having independence, the extractive structure and nature would often remain, which would impede economic growth for centuries. You can view this, a modern example I can think of is maybe the Belt and Roads Initiative that China's doing in Africa. There's definitely China is trying to make African countries be indebted to them by industrializing their entire area and modernizing it, infrastructure for a better quality of life. But in return, China can keep resources, they can keep assets, they can do an abundance of things, right? Uh, some economists say that this initiative would be doomed to fail. Um, we have yet to see it. It's still quite in the works. So I would uh I would say this extractive logic that China is using kind of reaches maybe into the transatlantic slave trade. So this reduction in transport kind of imposed human labor, right? It's commodification of human labor. It was cheap. And then 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to address the labor shortages in the American market. And this is a very moral conundrum that they have. Uh, Overall, I think going forward, even in our own modern times, we still deal with the possibilities of colonialism. Uh, Modern example would be maybe Venezuela or Greenland. Who knows, right? Okay. This has been my podcast. Thanks for watching.